A woman's brain was completely flatlined. Eyes taped. Ears blocked. She still accurately described her own surgery. Science has no explanation. Right now, your eyes are receiving information. Light is bouncing off every surface in your field of vision and firing signals into your brain. You feel like you're seeing reality. But here's what nobody tells you in school: the light your eyes can detect represents roughly 0.0035% of the entire electromagnetic spectrum. That's not a metaphor. That's a measurement. Radio waves, X-rays, gamma rays, infrared, ultraviolet, all of it is passing through your body right now, completely invisible to you. A mantis shrimp has 16 types of color receptors. You have 3. The question isn't whether invisible things exist. The question is how many of them you've already decided don't exist simply because you can't see them. In 1847, a Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis told his colleagues that invisible particles on their hands were killing patients. They laughed at him. Then institutionalized him. He died before anyone believed him. Those particles were bacteria, real, measurable, lethal. In 1905, Einstein proposed that space itself could bend. In 2015, LIGO detected gravitational waves produced by 2 black holes colliding 1.3 billion light-years away, a ripple in the fabric of spacetime smaller than 1/10,000th the diameter of a proton. That should have been impossible to detect. But technology caught up to the theory. Every single time science said something invisible was undetectable, the story ended the same way. What's still on that list? Science is the most powerful knowledge-generating tool humanity has ever produced. Nobody serious disputes that. But science has a definition, and the definition has a boundary. The scientific method requires a phenomenon to be observable, measurable, and repeatable. Those aren't optional. They're structural. Karl Popper, the philosopher who formalized this in 1934, called it falsifiability. A claim only enters science if it can, in principle, be proven wrong. But what happens if something real exists and never produces a measurable physical effect? Not because it's hiding, but because it operates outside the domain science was designed to study? What nobody in either camp likes to admit is this: science's inability to detect something is not the same as evidence it doesn't exist. Those are 2 completely different claims. And we've been confusing them for centuries. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, 5 traditions spanning 5 continents, thousands of years, and billions of people who disagree on almost everything. Yet every single one of them describes a reality beyond ordinary human perception. Not one. All of them. Independently. What nobody expected is the overlap in the description. The Hebrew Bible describes malachim, beings that exist outside ordinary physical space. The Quran describes jinn as beings created from smokeless fire, operating in a dimension adjacent to ours. Hindu texts describe devas operating across planes of existence science has no framework for. These aren't borrowed from each other. They emerged separately. That level of convergence across isolated civilizations either means something was genuinely observed or something deep in human cognition generates the same hallucination across every culture. Both possibilities should make you very uncomfortable. In 1954, physicist Hugh Everett III proposed something his colleagues considered insane: that every quantum measurement causes reality to branch into multiple parallel worlds. Not as a metaphor. As mathematics. Today this is called the many worlds interpretation, and it has serious defenders at Oxford and MIT. String theory, the leading candidate for a unified theory of physics, requires at minimum 10 dimensions of space. We experience 3. The remaining 7 are, mathematically, right here. But here's the strange part: none of this is evidence for spiritual beings. What it is evidence for is that theoretical physics has already accepted the idea that reality contains far more structure than human senses can access. The framework that would make spiritual beings mathematically possible already exists within physics. The question is whether it's the same framework. In 1995, philosopher David Chalmers stood in front of a room full of neuroscientists and asked a question that has not been answered since: why does physical brain activity produce subjective experience at all? Why does electrical firing in neurons become the feeling of seeing red, or tasting coffee, or loving someone? He called it the hard problem of consciousness. And it remains unsolved. Francis Crick, co-discoverer of DNA's structure, spent the last decade of his life trying to locate consciousness in the brain. He couldn't pin it down. Not because the brain isn't involved, it clearly is. But the gap between measurable neural activity and the interior experience of being alive has resisted every attempt at explanation. Some of the world's leading neuroscientists now openly admit, we don't know what consciousness is. And that gap right there is where this entire investigation changes. In 1991, a woman named Pam Reynolds underwent surgery to remove a brain aneurysm. Her brain was clinically flatlined. Her eyes were taped shut. Her ears were plugged with audio devices playing 95 decibel clicks. She had no measurable brain activity. When she woke up, she described the surgical instruments used on her in accurate detail, overheard a conversation between surgeons, and reported an experience of consciousness during the period her brain was offline. Cardiologist Pim van Lommel published a peer-reviewed study in The Lancet in 2001 tracking 344 cardiac arrest survivors. 18% reported near-death experiences. Crucially, some reported verified observations made while their brains showed no electrical activity. Critics argue brain processes during resuscitation could explain this. But the timing problem: observations made during confirmed flatline has not been fully resolved. Let's think like a scientist for a moment. If a spiritual being existed and never interacted with matter, energy, space, or time in any measurable way, it would be, by definition, scientifically undetectable. Not hidden. Not elusive. Categorically outside what instruments can measure. But here's where it gets interesting. If such a being did interact with the physical world even slightly, then in principle, science could investigate those interactions. The same way we detected neutrinos, particles so weakly interactive that trillions pass through your hand every second without touching a single atom. We built a detector in 1956 called the Cohen-Reines experiment, buried underground, and waited. The neutrino left a fingerprint. The question then becomes, have spiritual beings left fingerprints? And have we been building the wrong detectors? In 2012, the Global Consciousness Project, run out of Princeton University, analyzed data from 70 random number generators placed in 70 countries simultaneously. The hypothesis: if a global event produces a shared emotional response in millions of people, would the randomness of the generators shift? On September 11, 2001, the data showed a statistically anomalous deviation beginning 4 to 6 hours before the attacks. Researchers like Roger Nelson argue the effect is real. Critics like physicist Sean Carroll argue the methodology is fatally flawed and the results don't replicate under controlled conditions. What nobody disputes is this: a credentialed team at a major research university spent 2 decades trying to measure whether consciousness leaves a physical trace. They got ambiguous results. And ambiguous is not the same as nothing. A telescope is one of the most precise instruments ever built. It can resolve galaxies 13 billion light-years away. But you cannot use it to detect a bacterium. Not because the bacterium is too small for the concept of detection, it clearly isn't. But because a telescope was built to solve a specific kind of problem, and bacteria aren't that problem. Every instrument science possesses was built to detect something that interacts with the physical universe. That's not a flaw. That's a design choice. But the design choice has a consequence. Science, as currently constructed, has no instrument designed to detect something that exists entirely outside physical interaction. That's not a failure of science. It's a statement about what science is. The question worth sitting with is this: has anyone ever seriously tried to build the other kind of instrument? Records confirm that 96% of the universe is made of things science cannot directly detect. Dark matter, 27%. Dark energy, 68%. We know dark matter exists because of its gravitational effects on visible galaxies. We have never seen it, touched it, photographed it, or collected a sample. We inferred it. Now here's the uncomfortable part. The universe science is confident about the stars, planets, atoms, everything you have ever seen or touched makes up 4% of what exists. And the scientific community's response to that discovery wasn't to question whether reality might contain other undetected categories. It was to keep looking for better telescopes. The story of dark matter is the story of science discovering it had been missing most of reality for centuries and treating that as a routine update. What else is on the 96% list? Here's what this investigation was never really about. It was never about whether spirits exist. It was about something harder. What does it mean to know something? You began this documentary assuming science either confirms reality or rules it out. But Semmelweis was right when science said he was wrong. Dark matter is real despite being invisible. Consciousness exists despite having no agreed physical location. The history of human knowledge is not a story of instruments finding everything. It is a story of instruments finding everything they were built to find, and humans slowly realizing the map was never the territory. If something existed beyond the reach of every instrument ever designed, it would look, from inside science, exactly like nothing. The real question was never whether science can detect spiritual beings. It was whether you've ever examined what you're willing to call real and why.